Every morning, I'd step outside to find it again. Her massive SUV, parked smack in the middle of my farm. Not on the street. Not in some convenient spot. Right on my property, like I wasn't even there. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but then it happened again and again. Messages, polite requests, even warnings didn't work. She just smiled, shrugged, and said, "It's closer." Closer to what? And why did I feel my blood boiling every time I saw those tires on my land? I knew I couldn't let this slide. But what I did next completely stunned her. I'd lived on that small stretch of countryside for nearly a decade. Our farm wasn't huge, but it had enough open fields to let my kids run freely. Enough trees to shade a quiet porch, and a little garden where I grew everything from tomatoes to sunflowers. Mornings were calm, the kind where dew still clung to the grass and birdsong felt louder than any traffic. Life here had its simple rhythms: weekend chores, occasional neighbors waving from down the road, barbecues under the fading sun. Our community wasn't fancy, but we had a homeowners association. Mostly, it was harmless. Letters about trimming hedges, reminders about trash days, the occasional friendly nudge about paint colors. I had never had an issue. I liked following the rules, even if some felt a little overbearing. Then she moved in. Not just any neighbor, but the kind whose presence was immediately impossible to ignore. A shiny black SUV that gleamed like it had just driven out of a showroom, perfectly manicured gardens that screamed perfection, and a personality that seemed to demand the spotlight. At first, we exchanged polite greetings, cheerful smiles and small talk. But there was an edge I couldn't ignore, a subtle sense that she believed the rules didn't apply to her, or that she could bend them to suit her convenience. I tried not to think much of it. Life on the farm was quiet, and I told myself minor annoyances were just part of living near others. But when she first parked that SUV at the edge of my property, I felt a flicker of irritation I couldn't shake. Something about the audacity of it, so bold, so unapologetic, made my stomach tighten. I had no idea this small act would mark the beginning of a relentless and absurd battle that would push the boundaries of patience, legality, and neighborly decency. The first morning I noticed the SUV, I chalked it up to a misunderstanding. Maybe she was unloading groceries or visiting someone nearby. But by the second week, it had become clear this wasn't accidental. Every day, without fail, the black SUV would appear at the same spot at the edge of my property. It wasn't just inconvenient. It felt like a challenge. A silent declaration that my boundaries didn't matter. I started leaving polite notes on the windshield, short messages reminding her that she was on private property. At first, she ignored them. Then, one afternoon, she waved cheerfully as if we were old friends, muttering, "It's closer. Don't worry about it." That offhand remark sent a shiver down my spine. She wasn't just careless. She was deliberately flaunting the rules, testing my patience. It wasn't long before the HOA got involved. At first, their notices were minor, even almost amusing. A warning about vehicles stored improperly, or a reminder that no object could encroach upon neighboring properties. I responded respectfully, showing evidence that my farm wasn't violating any rules. But soon, their tone shifted. Letters arrived daily, accusing me of failure to maintain compliance and threatening fines. The stakes were rising, and it felt like every day I had to justify the land I had owned for years. Meanwhile, the SUV continued its silent invasion. My children would approach the car cautiously, asking if the neighbor had left anything behind, or if she was coming to get something. Every glance at that black behemoth sent a pang of frustration through me. The farm that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. Friends who visited started noticing, asking if there had been an argument, or if I'd had trouble with neighbors. I wanted to laugh it off, but inside, my anger simmered. Then came the petty escalations. The HOA began citing me for improper landscape aesthetics, claiming that my hay bales were unsightly from the street. Another letter accused me of blocking a community line of sight, because a small fence I had built to keep the kids safe supposedly violated rules. Every time I called to appeal, I was met with vague excuses, polite yet condescending reassurances that rules are rules, and everyone must comply equally. Meanwhile, the SUV remained parked smugly on my property, a daily reminder of the imbalance of power. One particularly tense afternoon, I tried to confront the neighbor directly. I approached the SUV with a mixture of fear and determination, prepared to ask her to move one more time. She opened the door before I could even speak, offering a saccharine smile that made my blood boil. "I'm just closer to the road," she said casually, as if that explained everything. No apology. No acknowledgement that this was my property. I walked away, fists clenched, realizing that reasoning alone would not work. As days turned into weeks, the harassment escalated in subtle but relentless ways. Letters from the HOA now included threats of escalating fines, legal action, and even the possibility of liens. Every interaction felt designed to wear me down, to make me doubt myself, to make me feel like the unreasonable one. Yet through it all, the SUV stayed parked, unshakable, a silent provocateur. I started documenting everything. Photos of the SUV, copies of letters, stamped notes of every encounter. My frustration grew into a focused determination. I knew I couldn't allow this to continue, but I had to act strategically. A reckless confrontation could backfire, giving the HOA or the neighbor an excuse to escalate even further. Tensions reached a breaking point when she began leaving personal items near the edge of my land. Shopping bags, a lawn chair, even a small cooler. Each item was a small, deliberate invasion, a reminder that my boundaries were meaningless. I felt trapped in my own home, my private farm slowly turning into a stage for her audacious antics. Friends suggested calling the police, but I feared it would escalate things legally and socially. It was during one particularly stormy afternoon that I realized I needed to take decisive action. Rain poured down, turning the fields to mud, and the black SUV sat like a monument to defiance. I stood on the porch, watching, imagining all the possible ways I could respond. And then I remembered something from the property documents, a clause that could work in my favor if I played it correctly. My heart pounded. I had an opening, a way to reclaim what was mine without breaking any rules. But I knew the next steps would require patience, precision, and a cold sense of timing. One wrong move, and it could spiral into a legal nightmare. One right move, however, and everything could shift, the power imbalance. The daily harassment, even the audacity of that SUV, could collapse in my favor. I didn't yet know what would happen, only that I had to act soon. The calm before the storm had ended. The real battle was about to begin. All came to a head on a scorching Thursday morning, the kind of day where the air feels heavy, and even small annoyances seem magnified. I had spent weeks preparing, meticulously documenting everything. The SUV parked on my land, the letters from the HOA, the petty and escalating infractions they tried to pin on me. Each piece of evidence was a thread I could pull, a thread that, if handled correctly, would unravel the carefully maintained facade of control my neighbor and the HOA wielded. That morning, I saw it again. The black SUV, gleaming in the sun like a challenge, had arrived precisely where it always did. The owner emerged, sunglasses in place, and waved at me with that same infuriating smile. But I was ready. I had already coordinated with the towing company, confirmed all the paperwork, and double-checked the legal rights I had to remove vehicles trespassing on private property. Every instruction, every warning, every letter from the HOA that tried to intimidate me had only strengthened my resolve. Today, the balance of power would shift. I approached the edge of the property, not with anger, but with a quiet, deliberate confidence. As I spoke to the tow operator over the phone, the neighbor's smile faltered slightly, replaced by confusion. She didn't see it coming. The methodical, calm response I had crafted. By the time I hung up, the tow truck was on its way, and I could almost see the panic in her posture. She attempted to reason, to plead, but all of her charm and flippant remarks were meaningless against the weight of legality and preparation. The operator arrived, lights flashing faintly, a professional, silent figure who didn't tolerate debate. I watched as my neighbor's face shifted from smugness to disbelief, her words tumbling in frantic repetition, each one ignored as the vehicle was tagged and prepared for towing. Every step was deliberate, calculated. No confrontation, no shouting. Just the undeniable fact that her SUV was on my land, and she had no right to leave it there. I could feel a mixture of vindication and adrenaline coursing through me. A rare clarity born from months of frustration finally coming to fruition. Neighbors began to notice, drawn out by the flashing lights and the unusual spectacle. Some watched from a distance, curious. Others whispered among themselves about the audacity of the SUV owner. The entire scene felt like the slow motion culmination of everything I had endured. The petty letters, the veiled threats, the daily trespass of my property. And then, it happened. The tow operator gave the final signal, and the SUV began to move, leaving my property and the carefully maintained illusion of dominance that my neighbor had built. Her reaction was instant and visceral. She screamed, yelling over the growl of the tow truck, her words lost in the clamor, a mix of outrage and disbelief. For months she had treated my land as if it were a shared parking lot, flaunting rules and boundaries with impunity. And now, in one swift, decisive action, everything she relied on to assert control had vanished. I watched as her carefully constructed sense of superiority crumbled, replaced by raw panic and humiliation. For the first time, the audacity of her actions collided with real-world consequences. But the climax wasn't just about the SUV leaving my land. It was the tidal wave of momentum this single event created. I had already submitted a formal complaint to the HOA, including every documented interaction and every instance of harassment. The legal framework I had painstakingly prepared turned out to be airtight. Their earlier threats of fines and liens came back to haunt them, as the HOA board faced a clear, undeniable record of mismanagement, overreach, and intimidation. My evidence showed not only the trespassing SUV, but also how their rules had been applied selectively, how their oversight had allowed a neighbor to harass me without consequence. By the time the HOA convened a special meeting, the tension in the air was palpable. Board members whispered among themselves, shuffling papers, clearly unprepared for the avalanche of documentation I presented. I stayed calm, letting the facts speak for themselves. The vehicle trespasses, the letters of intimidation, the misapplication of community rules. The room was silent, a rare and satisfying quiet that carried the weight of justice. I watched as the board, which had seemed untouchable for months, realized their authority was finally under scrutiny. Meanwhile, word of the SUV incident spread through the community. Friends, neighbors, Even casual acquaintances had witnessed the Tao, and whispers of the event reached far beyond the confines of our street. My neighbor, who had once wielded her presence like a weapon, was now publicly humiliated, trapped in a social spotlight she clearly wasn't prepared to handle. Every smile she had flashed, every casual "it's closer" remark, had built up to this very moment. Watching the stark contrast between her earlier audacity and current vulnerability was unexpectedly satisfying, a culmination of months of pent-up frustration and meticulous preparation. Yet, the most emotionally charged moment arrived when she tried to argue legality, claiming that the tow was unwarranted. But the tow operator, and more importantly, my documentation, left no room for debate. I presented the property deed, photographs, timestamps, and a clear timeline of harassment. Every claim she made was met with evidence that countered it, and for the first time, she had no shield, no loophole, no authority to wield. Her flustered attempts to reclaim control only underscored the absurdity of her previous behavior. In that tense, charged room, the turning point became undeniable. The SUV was gone. The HOA's selective enforcement was exposed. The neighbor's audacity had been met with unassailable preparation, calm resolve, and the quiet power of facts. Emotions ran high on all sides. The mix of satisfaction, relief, and vindication washed over me, but it was tempered by the awareness that battles with human pettiness can linger. Still, in this precise moment, victory was absolute. Months of stress, sleepless nights, and simmering frustration coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. Boundaries had been enforced, and respect had been reclaimed. Even as I left the meeting, the neighborhood buzzing with quiet chatter, the finality of the SUV's removal felt surreal. For months, a symbol of disregard and arrogance had occupied my property, a daily reminder of intrusion and imbalance. Now, with the vehicle gone, the silent but intense pressure that had shadowed my days was lifted. I could walk freely, breathe easily, and know that for the first time in this saga, I had prevailed without stooping to the level of petty retaliation. Yet, even in that moment of triumph, a small tension lingered. The awareness that human nature, especially when mixed with power, rules, and ego, can find new ways to challenge, harass, and frustrate. I knew this victory was significant, but the story wasn't fully over. The aftershocks would ripple through the HOA, through the neighbor's reputation, and through the community, leaving consequences far beyond the simple removal of one vehicle. As I walked back to the porch, sunlight falling across the farm, I couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. The months of tension, the petty harassment, the relentless audacity of a neighbor who thought rules were optional. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, I realized something profound: preparedness, patience, and unwavering commitment to what is right can turn even the most daunting confrontation into a moment of absolute clarity and justice. The black SUV was gone, the neighbor stunned, and the HOA forced to reckon with its own overreach. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the next chapter was waiting. The farm was mine again, yes, but the battle had revealed just how fragile civility can be, and how satisfying it is to reclaim what was always yours. One question lingered, sharp and irresistible: what would she do next? Knowing that her audacity had finally met a wall she could not topple. After the SUV was finally removed and the HOA's selective enforcement had been exposed, a slow but undeniable sense of relief settled over the farm. For the first time in months, I could walk through my fields without a constant knot of tension in my chest. The air felt lighter, almost as if the land itself was breathing a sigh of relief. But the aftermath of the conflict went far. beyond a single cleared parking spot. What unfolded in the weeks and months that followed was a complicated mixture of personal vindication, community reshaping, and lessons I would carry for the rest of my life. Immediately, the HOA was forced to confront its mismanagement. Board members who had once wielded letters and vague threats like weapons now had to face the reality that their selective enforcement had created an environment ripe for conflict. They held emergency meetings, trying to rewrite rules and clarify enforcement procedures. Some members were defensive, insisting they had done their best to maintain order, but the evidence I presented had already circulated through community channels. My meticulous documentation, the photos, timestamps, letters, and records of communication, became a reference point that could not be disputed. Suddenly, the rules are rules mantra that had felt suffocating was being re-evaluated. The HOA could no longer rely on vague threats to assert authority. Every decision now had to withstand scrutiny. Neighbors began to notice the shift as well. Casual whispers turned into conversations, and conversations became active discussions about fairness, accountability, and respect for property. Those who had quietly watched the conflict unfold realized just how much tension had been simmering under the surface. Some admitted they had felt similarly powerless when confronted with overreach, but had been too intimidated to act. My victory, while intensely personal, served as a reminder to the broader community. Even in a small neighborhood, one person's resolve can inspire others to speak up. The neighbor herself became a cautionary tale. Her public humiliation over the SUV was not just a fleeting moment, it had lasting consequences. Conversations circulated, and soon, the social dynamics shifted. Invitations that had once included her quietly disappeared. Her attempts to assert dominance through the HOA's rules, or by flaunting her vehicle, were no longer effective. People began to see her as someone who tested boundaries without regard for others. Even mundane acts, like parking near the road or leaving items on my land, were now met with subtle but firm resistance from multiple neighbors. A social reinforcement of boundaries that had once been ignored. In the weeks that followed, I realized that the most significant change wasn't just in the removal of the SUV or the exposed mismanagement of the HOI. It was in the restoration of control over my own life and property. For months, every glance toward that corner of the farm had triggered frustration and anxiety. Every HOA letter had been a small assault on my peace of mind. Now, I could step outside, look across the fields, and see my space as it was meant to be, a sanctuary, not a battlefield. The feeling of calm was intoxicating, almost surreal after so many weeks of tension. The neighbor eventually attempted to push back, filing complaints and informal challenges with the HOA. But each attempt was met with firm, documented responses. Because I had anticipated the need for thorough preparation, I was able to respond quickly, presenting evidence that left no room for ambiguity. Over time, her efforts dwindled. The pattern of audacity, followed by public consequence, had been firmly established. Her presence no longer dictated the pace of my life, and I slowly regained the simple joy of living on the farm. The SUV incident became less a daily obsession and more a story to share. Proof that persistence and preparation could overturn even the most brazen disregard for boundaries. There were broader consequences, too. The HOA, shaken by the public exposure and by the clear record of selective enforcement, began to implement more transparent and fair procedures. Meetings were scheduled with greater attention to detail. Enforcement rules were clarified, and mechanisms were introduced to ensure that all residents were treated equally. While these changes were small at first, they had a lasting impact on the culture of the community. What had once felt like arbitrary control became something more accountable, more predictable. The fight I endured didn't just resolve a personal dispute, it triggered structural change. Emotionally, the resolution was profound. Months of simmering anger and helplessness had transformed into a sense of empowerment. The daily anxiety that had colored simple routines, morning coffee on the porch, checking the fields, even casual walks with my children, was replaced by confidence. I had faced a relentless and audacious challenge, navigated legal and social complexities, and emerged victorious without compromising my own integrity. It was a rare and gratifying feeling, the knowledge that when boundaries are tested, deliberate, calm action can restore not just physical control, but emotional equilibrium. The children, too, felt the shift. What had once been a source of subtle tension, seeing the SUV parked at the edge of our property, wondering if this neighbor might escalate again, was replaced with normalcy. They ran freely through the fields, played near the porch, and engaged with the farm as they had before the conflict. Witnessing the resolution reinforced an important lesson. Standing up for one's space and rights, even in the face of audacity and small-scale bullying, teaches resilience and self-respect. I realized that the fight wasn't just about property. It was about modeling assertiveness and accountability for the next generation. As time went on, the farm regained its natural rhythm. Mornings were once again filled with bird songs and the quiet hum of chores. Afternoon light cast long shadows across the fields, the kind that invite reflection and stillness. And though the neighbor remained in the community, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Her audacious, boundary-pushing behaviors no longer went unchallenged, and the subtle network of community awareness ensured that any attempts at overreach would be met with immediate resistance. What had once been a personal feud had ripple effects that redefined social dynamics, accountability, and respect in our neighborhood. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized that the story was not just about a single SUV or a single neighbor's audacity. It was about the nature of boundaries, both physical and social, and the importance of enforcing them. Property disputes, HOA overreach, and petty conflicts often escalate not because one party is aggressive, but because the other allows them to define the terms of engagement. By taking deliberate, well-documented, and strategic action, it is possible to reclaim control, restore respect, and even drive broader changes that benefit the entire community. There were subtle lessons, too, about patience and emotional intelligence. I could have reacted impulsively, yelling, confronting, or attempting public shaming, but doing so might have backfired. Instead, I relied on preparation, documentation, and the calm application of rules to assert authority. This approach not only secured the immediate goal, the removal of the SUV, but also prevented escalation that could have caused long-term conflict, legal trouble, or emotional exhaustion. It was a lesson that power, when wielded calmly and strategically, can be far more effective than force or emotion alone. Months later, friends and neighbors would occasionally mention the saga, marveling at how a single determined homeowner had shifted the dynamics of an entire community. Some laughed at the absurdity of it all, the audacity of parking on someone else's farm, the petty HOA letters, the black SUV that became a symbol of defiance. But the laughter was always tinged with respect. The story became more than entertainment. It became a cautionary tale, a roadmap for asserting rights, and a testament to the fact that even small-scale conflicts can be resolved decisively. Ultimately, the impact was both tangible and emotional. My property was secure, My daily routines were peaceful. The HOA had been forced to act fairly. And the neighbor had learned, in a very public and undeniable way, that audacity without accountability has consequences. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned a deeper lesson about confidence, preparation, and the importance of standing firm. Respect is earned, boundaries must be defended, and sometimes the most satisfying victories are those won quietly, decisively, and without surrendering one's own integrity. Even now, years later, the farm feels different. The memory of the SUV is no longer a source of anger, but a reminder. Audacity will always meet resistance if boundaries are clear and one is prepared to defend them. Friends who visit comment on the sense of peace, the sense of reclaimed space, and the subtle but powerful transformation in the community. What had begun as a personal conflict evolved into a story of empowerment, fairness, and the enduring importance of respecting both property and people. Standing on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees, I often reflect on the absurdity and intensity of those months. The SUV, the letters, the meetings, and the confrontations all seem almost cinematic in hindsight. A story that could have been just another frustrating chapter in small, community living, but became a defining moment. It taught me that while neighbors and HOA boards can be unreasonable, audacious, or even petty, there is always a path forward if one acts strategically, calmly, and decisively. And so the farm is mine again, not just in deed, but in spirit. The peace that had once felt threatened now feels earned. The community, once tense and watchful, now operates with greater fairness and accountability. And the neighbor? She remains, a quiet reminder that audacity unchecked can lead to consequences, that boundaries matter, and that some lessons must be learned the hard way. In the end, the story isn't just about a vehicle or an overbearing HOA. It's about courage, preparation, and the subtle but undeniable power of standing firm. It's about reclaiming your space, your peace, and your sense of justice without losing sight of your own integrity. And as I watch the farm glow in the afternoon light, I ask myself, and anyone listening, this: if you ever find your boundaries tested, will you let audacity define your life, or will you take a stand, prepared and unwavering, and show that respect is never optional?